Okay, welcome everybody to POWTS Chat here for May. Um, one of the things we're going to go through today is I think Josh is going to talk about some stuff later on, but I've got a little presentation here on some flooding. So it happens to be interesting. Katie just shared with me that one of her counties just shared some information on flooding that they have. So just want to talk about a few of the things that are related to flooding and POWT systems. Um, whatever areas of concern. I mean, flooding can happen really anywhere. Mostly we think it's associated with, living on a river or something like that. But technically we could get flooding anywhere, poor drainage or something like that, large catastrophic rainfall event. We could get flooding anywhere, but there are specific requirements for us if we are in some of those flood zones, and especially in the flood plains. So we're going to take a look at what exactly some of those definitions are, what are the requirements associated with that, what do we need to do, what do we need to look out for. So the elements of a floodplain, this is sort of a cross section showing you sort of what the normal channel of a body of water is. And we have a few terms that we're going to have to be familiar with. So like a base flood elevation, that is the elevation determined to be representative of the flood. And typically that's usually a 1% frequency in a year, or what they call used to call a 100-year flood. Or basically you have 1% chance each year. So in 100 years, you would anticipate that you would have a flood that would occur. And then some other terms that we need to be familiar with is what's called the floodway and then the flood fringe. So both of those comprise what's called the floodplain. This is just sort of another way to look at it, sort of a real world photo. You can see that the floodway is in the middle, and then on the edges of that are the flood fringe, and everything encompasses the floodplain. So the floodway is the channel portion of a river stream, those portions of the adjoining channel that carries the flood discharge. So the floodway is what you can think of as sort of the active flooding area. That's going to be carrying basically moving water. A flood fringe is typically that portion outside the floodway, which has extra flood water during a regional flood. So it's usually more associated with standing water rather than flowing water, or not always standing, but much slower moving water on the flood fringe. And then there's some other terms that are used. Zone AE, that's the base floodplain where regional flood elevations are provided, and Zone A. So these are sort of some mapping definitions that we'll look at here in a little bit. So base floodplains are mapped approximate methods. So Zone A is not really well defined. So they're often called unnumbered A zone or approximate A zones. So without a study, you'll see a map that will have a Zone A, and it doesn't really differentiate between the floodway and the flood fringe. So everything has to be treated as a floodway if we're mapped as a Zone A. So where can we find this information? Couple different places. DNR has a surface water data viewer, so you can go on there and you can see that these zones are mapped as AE on here. So there has been a study that shows what that regional flood elevation is. A lot of times the county GIS websites, they have that information that they provided on there. And you can see this crosshatch area here. We'll show you also, what is mapped as the floodplain or the flood zones. So you can see here, it'll tell you whether it's a Zone AE or whether it's just a Zone A. There may also be some detailed flood study maps, so you can check with your county on these. They may have them on the GIS. There may be some detailed ones. So this one in here has some Zone A's, AEs listed that they have it. They've got some elevations on here for what the flooding is, and there may also be some other detailed maps, boundaries where there may have been a flood study in a certain area. So sometimes you'll find these where everything may be Zone A, but you may have a detailed flood study in a certain area that somebody may have done to determine whether their house or their system is in a floodway or not. Other detailed maps, I mean, there's a lot of different ones out there. So here's another one where they have a river study here, and they have a bunch of cross sections across the river showing what the different elevations are. So that can be really helpful for determining what your regional flood elevation is. Much more so than these kind of maps. Here you have a zone A, where there's really no differentiation between the floodway and the flood fringe. So in this case, everything has to be treated as a floodway unless there would be a subsequent study down the road or a more detailed study to determine exactly what part is the floodway or the flood fringe. So when we have this information, what do we do with it? To what elevation do we need to flood proof, or would we have to take a look at? So AE zones provide base flood elevations that can be used to calculate flood protection elevation. So if you're in between the lines, you can interpolate between those. So if we have on the upper left here, it says 1442, 1439. So we can interpolate or extrapolate in there, about what our elevation is going to be. But, those are helpful to know, or actually, going to be essential for us to know to what is the flood elevation. That's going to tell us to where we have to flood proof. A zones don't provide that, but again, we don't differentiate between the floodplain and the flood fringe on these. So we have to consider everything part or floodway and flood fringe. So everything in the floodplain is considered a floodway. Therefore, we're going to have to take the maximum extent. So on these, you can look at the elevations on the contour lines or topo lines, and you can see whatever the maximum extent is here. So like the center one, we're roughly about at 80. That would be our elevation that we would have to consider as our flood elevation, and then go off of there for any kind of protection that we would need. So what elevation do we need to flood proof? Well, that's going to depend on what your map is. Again, whether you're a flood way or flood fringe or zone A, that we can't differentiate, and everything has to be considered a floodway. If you have a detailed study, you could use those. Otherwise, we're going to have to go off of what that regional flood elevation is, and then we're going to have to protect above that. So POWTS and the floodplains. So what is the requirements for us? SPS 383 32 3C says, except as provided in NR 116, and there's a couple sections here we'll look at in a minute, no part of a POWTS may be installed in a floodway. So we can't be in a floodway. And again, if we don't differentiate between those, then we're going to have to, like, for instance, a zone A considers everything a floodway. We can't put any kind of system in there. If we're in a floodplain farther, 383.45 parent 6, any treatment tanks, holding or dispersal tanks that are located in the floodplain areas, so this would most likely be a flood fringe, shall be made and maintained watertight to prevent infiltration. So any kind of surface openings we have, we're going to have to make sure that we have like a neoprene gasket or something like that, and they're bolted down to keep any kind of flood waters from infiltrating those tanks. Also, vent pipes serving POWTS components are located in a floodplain have to terminate at least 2 feet above regional flood levels. So either the tanks have to be made watertight to prevent the infiltration, or we have to go 2 feet above regional flood elevation levels to make sure that we're not having any kind of infiltration into those systems. The NR116s that we just looked at before that were referenced, they state basically any sewage system, public or private, except portable latrines, so those would be like the porta potties that can be removed, or systems associated with recreational areas. So they do give an exception for that. They have to meet all the provisions, local ordinances, and SPS 383. And further, NR 116.15 says no new private sewage system or addition to an existing private sewage system may be allowed in a floodway area. Any maintenance, repair, or replacement of the private sewage system in the floodway shall meet the requirements and any kind of local ordinances. So they do allow repairs. So, I mean, if somebody is already built in a floodplain, floodway, and they have to repair a system, I mean, they could do that or replace the system. They just can't do any kind of new ones. And here's some more information provided from the DNR. Gives more in detail. And if we have questions on that, exactly what they're allowing or not allowing, we're going to have to refer to the DNR for some more guidance on that. But again, in the floodway, no new POWTS can be done. They have some requirements, repair, replacement, and what's required for that. Flood fringe, again, we can do systems in there as long as they meet our SPS 383. There's also some requirements from the DNR that we have to make sure, one, that we're not introducing any kind of floodwaters into the system. The DNR may also have some requirements associated with any kind of above ground systems in a flood fringe. They're going to need to okay that to make sure that we're not impeding any kind of flow of floodwaters in those flood fringes. So what are some of our concerns? Why are we doing this? Obviously, there's some concerns with it. So one might be, a physical damage to components. So these are some pictures from Lake Delton when they had some flooding down there. This is one of our concerns here. Physical damage and erosion. Here you can see septic system pipes that are sticking out. So we have to protect our systems. This is a little bit more difficult to make sure that we're not in an area where we're going to have some kind of erosion or physical damage to the systems. May want to take care when if we are putting a system out there, to make sure that it's not going to be eroded or any kind of damage is going to occur to the system from the floodwaters themselves. I mean, that's difficult to do, but need to take care of that. Also, our tanks are, if we're in an area that's flooded, tanks could float even concrete. So here's a bunch of different pictures where we've had flooding, saturated soils here. The tanks will pop up on out of the ground. Some people think it's really hard to imagine that concrete tanks float, but battleships float. They're made of steel concrete tanks. If we're displacing more water than the weight of the tank, they're going to come up and out of the ground on us. So we got to make sure that we're keeping them in the ground and anchoring them. So some of the flood proofing techniques that we have for POWTS systems, any kind of, to counteract the buoyancy, we have to do anchoring. So different ways that you can do that is you can attach, concrete collar, dead man anchor, something on top of them, strap them down with the anchor weights. People either pour some concrete in there and strap it down to it, or use like the road barriers as an anchor. They'll tie to that, which will help anchor that tank down. Also, we can use the soil cover over top of the tank. So we'll basically take the volume displaced, and as long as the tank plus the soil cover is more than that, we can anchor the tank into the ground to make sure that it's not going to come up out of the ground. And you can check the SPS 383, the appendix, for the calculations in there. Typically, it's 150% safety factor, or 1.5% or 1.5 times safety factor for the anchoring for those tanks. So again, make sure that, and this goes not only for those areas that are flooding, but just if we know we have wet areas, people putting holding tanks in, it's similar to that. Make sure that we're anchoring them to keep them from coming up out of the ground. So what are some other floodplain concerns that we have? Inundation, infiltration. Not only are we, if we're underneath water, we're going to have possibly a contamination of water. Also, the homeowners don't want to have backups into their building. Obviously, if we're underwater and we get any kind of infiltration into that system, not only are we flooding out the system and have possibility for contamination, but we're also going to possibly be backing stuff up into that home or that building. So what are some floodproofing techniques for POWTS? So infiltration of floodwater, gaskets or seals, entrances to the tank, bolt down the covers. So we have to get information from the manufacturer if they can provide us something to say, we've got a rubber gasket or something that they can do to seal their tank covers, make sure that they don't have any kind of infiltration, that they are watertight. You can also install things like a check valve or backflow preventer on the sewer lines to make sure that if it is, in a flood and we do get infiltration, that it's not coming back up into the building. And then also for any of our observation pipes or vents, they have to terminate at least 2 feet above the regional flood elevation levels. So we have to be above that to make sure that we're not getting any kind of water that's going to enter back into that system. So what do we do post flooding? So let's say, we've taken our precautions and we are in a flooding situation. So we will need to service the tanks and aerobic treatment units. We need to go out there. We need to pump them out and clean them out to make sure, we'll inspect them, make sure there's no kind of damage that's been done. But we can't pump the tanks out until the soil's drained. So we got to wait till the flooding goes down. Really shouldn't be putting those systems into use. Um, but need to empty the tanks. But be careful when they empty them out, as we also have to make sure again that the water levels are down, because if the water soils are still saturated and we try to empty that tank, what do? We're putting stress on the tank to possibly pop them up out of the ground. Need to pump the silt out of the bottom of them. Sometimes there is infiltration, or we'll pull the risers apart, or we may have some surface infiltration to the top if things didn't work out, or especially on sites that may not be in a floodplain and we just had some flooding anyway. You need to pump the silt out of them. And then again, as part of the inspection, we need to clean, test, and repair any kind of components, look for any damage, make sure everything's good. Then also, if there's a pump involved, we need to check any kind of electrical connections. With it being underwater, we could damage or corrode those connections. We need to check those to make sure that they're still good. But wait to use the soil absorption components, until it dries out. If the soils are still wet, we can't be using a system. System's not going to function if everything's saturated out there. And then you should come back and take a look at that system. Don't just go out there, pump it out, put it back into use. Come back in a week or two and check it a couple times, make sure that everything is going along well and that it is functioning properly. So here's just a case where we did have an issue. This is years ago, but some good pictures here. This happened in Chippewa County. There was a Stilson Elementary School back in '95 that did have a flooding event. So here they had some flooding. Now again, this one does not appear to be in a floodplain, but they did get flooded out. And then what happened? Without everything being adequately proofed from flooding or infiltration, they had a lot of sediment, a lot of dirt flowed in there, sort of filled up their system. So as you can see here, they had some problems that they had to take care of. They had to pump their tanks out, get rid of that silt, get rid of that sedimentation that had flooded out their system. So the next thing I want to talk about is about soils and floodplains. So what are some issues that we'd see? So, okay, if we're putting a system in, we can flood-proof it. We can find our elevations based on the maps from the DNR that the county's providing. We get our base elevations. We know we got to go 2 feet above with our openings. Okay, so we can do that. But then we also have to evaluate the sites themselves and say, how are we going to determine what we're going to do out on there? So what are some of the issues that we have with soils and floodplains? We could possibly have some structure issues, that it's plainy or structureless out there based on the nature of the alluvial soils. We could have high organic contents, makes it difficult to see what's going on because of the organic sediments that are being deposited. And our limiting factor, how reliable is looking at redox in a floodplain? So here's a few photos that Katie had forwarded to me. This is a park here. It's actually over by the Twin Cities, but we're still going to use it. It's a good example here. So here we have a floodplain in a park. Now, if they were going to put a system out here, this sort of shows you the red arrow, sort of where we're taking a look at. So you can see we're really close to the Mississippi. We're adjacent to it. These are alluvial soils for the Mississippi waterway. And here's our floodplain map. So it shows zone AE. So we do have good information that shows us what our regional flood elevation is going to be. So we can put our pipes or inlets of our tanks up to make sure that we meet that. But again, what are the soils? What are we taking a look at? So here we have a profile, got some information here, and you can see some characteristics that sort of stick out. So a couple of the things is you notice that we have some alternating colors. We're like 4-2 to 6-3, 3-2, 6-4, 3-2, 6-4. We're hitting back and forth, and you can see it's every few inches we're dropping back and forth on this. So what's going on is that as the river changes its course, we're having depositional events, and we're having some fine sands, loamy fine sands, things being deposited out there. A lot of organic matter loading, so it may be a flood event, and then it has some time development, and then another large flood event. We're back and forth. So you can see here we don't have any structure, so we got loamy fine sands. Maybe it is a little bit finer. Maybe we do have some things going on, but we don't have any kind of redox. Also, you note that we have shells and plant material. So that's sort of interesting. Well, here's some of the series in here, and you can see that they have, even here in the AP horizon on the Chaska series, it also says fine fragments of snail shells. We've got some weird stuff going on in here. Not the greatest, but why aren't we seeing redox? I mean, we're not seeing any redox being reported in here. So what are some of the issues that we may have? It's dark soils, and we may not be seeing it. So we also have to remember that redox formation requires a few things, that we have to be anaerobic conditions, saturation or near saturation. So in a floodplain, we can surmise that we're occurring. We need to have a source of organic matter. But then again, organic matter can also cover it up and make it difficult for us to see. A right temperature, right pH. So depending on when this flooding happens, we may or may not have redox form. And we have to have iron or manganese present, which is typically common in most soils. But then also reduction of iron occurs when water moves through soil slowly. If it's oxygenated, we got fast-moving flood waters that are oxygenated and it's flowing fast. We're not necessarily going to get redox that are going to form. Also, fast-moving water through sands and gravels. We're not necessarily going to see that. So we have to be careful when we do get into some of these floodplains, things like this, that it may be difficult for us to see the redox. Because of the way the soils are layered down. But we see these alternating back and forth, and I've even seen some that are much smaller, only maybe like a half inch between each horizon that are alternating layers. It may be difficult to see redox. The redox may not have formed. We may also get platy structure out there, or depositional kind of platy, just from the way that it's being laid down. Not necessarily great sites to put our systems anyway. So regardless of the flood proofing and other requirements we have, we also have to take a careful look at the soils to make sure that we're not missing a limiting factor or having other extenuating circumstances that are going to cause us problems with treatment down the road. But anyway, that's sort of a quick sort of overview of flooding and POWTS. And I think I'm going to hand it off now to Josh.
Excellent. Let me share my screen here. So today I'm going to discuss briefly the UV lamp that has been approved. All right, so we have a new UV lamp that is required to be used for fecal reduction. Basically, every occurrence, if somebody's trying to get reduced separation credits. With this Norweco UV lamp, it's important to note one of the big things is the forward flow or instantaneous flow through each light shall not exceed 1.59 gallons per minute. The designer or plumber would have the option to add multiple lights. Otherwise, they're going to have to forward flow or dose this volume at 1.59 gallons per minute. And that's the gallons per minute were set by the NSF results. This unit also has to be used with a pre-treatment product, whether it's a biomicrobics or a Delta or any of the other pre-treatment units. It has to be in front of this unit in order to flow at 1.59 gallons per minute. your BOD and TSS have to be less than 30, along with FOG being less than 30. And that's spelled out in the approval letter pretty clear. Another issue with the lamps is they're going to require inspection and maintenance every 6 months. So there should be a separate maintenance agreement recorded on the deed for these, so they can specifically see the requirements for the UV lamp. The 6-month interval is going to verify that it's working. They need to disassemble the unit, clean it, and then put it back together again. And the bulb life is no greater than 24 months. Depending on, in most cases, they're 23, 24 months is the life expectancy. So there's some cases where they're going to last, the bulb is going to last much longer. At 23 or 24 months, it's not going to be burned out, but the output isn't going to be there any longer to work effectively. So that's why the bulb replacement must be done at an interval of less than 24 months, or whenever the output is below the NSF standard, whichever occurs first. The work has to be done by a credentialed POWTS maintainer, and that person has to be trained to work on this UV lamp. With the use of the lamp, they do get the fecal credit for reduction in vertical separation. An important note with this is that the UV unit is to follow an appropriately sized pre-treatment unit that meets the department's discharge standards for highly treated effluent and shall come after a settling/clarifying chamber if the pre-treatment unit requires one. So you may very well have a septic tank or a trash tank, as people like to call them, your treatment tank, a clarifying tank, a dose tank, so then you can dose to the UV unit. So then you're going to have a tank that the UV unit is into, and then a final dose tank because you have to use pressure distribution. I believe Delta has a product where this would actually install within one of their units. So it'd be discharging the appropriate effluent. So again, the additional comments is a guide. If you have agent status and you have any questions, please reach out to me and we can discuss. Each design is going to be a little bit different. We also require that a manufacturer or manufacturer rep, which could be a salesperson from a supply house, be on site for the first installation. And then we're going to have to figure out with POWTS maintainers, they're going to have to reach out to the department for their training. So whoever is going to sign that maintenance agreement that's going to get recorded, they're going to need to reach out so we can do a little training session with them. With the approval letter, there's a lot of additional information attached, and it's available on ISLA. But it kind of gives a background on the AT1500, how it works, and all the components. The nuts and bolts of it are the installation and operation manual. It's pretty cut and dry. I can go into more detail. I don't expect that you guys are going to see a lot of these units, although you never know. They may be retrofit depending on what people are wanting to do or what they need to do also. I don't know how many people are familiar with these or have even heard of them yet, but if you can't find it on ISLA, you're welcome to send me an email and I can send you a direct link also. So there's a main assembly and then a sub-assembly. So the sub-assembly is what slides out for maintenance. Their book's pretty good here on how this all works. My mouse isn't cooperating now. It talks about cleaning the quart sleeve, you know, what needs to be done for this each maintenance cycle, and then effluent testing is also going to need to be done to verify that the system is working properly, especially if they're taking the fecal credits. We'll have a more in-depth training, hopefully at our next POWTS Chat in June. If anybody gets any plans that include these units in the meantime, reach out and we can do a one-on-one Teams training session on the actual installation and what to look for at your inspections and things like that too. Are there any questions on this UV lamp at this time? I know this is a very brief introduction to make everybody aware that the fact that the product has finally been approved, so we can move forward with that.
Josh, what is the best way to find this in Isla Public Lookup? Is it by the manufacturer name or by a product category, or what is the
My
most
preference,
reliable way to find it?
yep, I would search by the manufacturer, which is Norweco, not to be confused with Norwesco. So it's Norweco, not Norwesco. And that'll give you the fastest link to their products. And then you can find the AT1500 within their products also.
Thank you. Does the 6-month maintenance interval require anything besides cleaning of the lamp and making sure that it's still functional, or what else is required at that 6-month interval?
The 6-month intervals are going to be to disassemble and clean it, and then reinstalling it. That way you're just ensuring that the device is clean and you're getting the transmittance of the UV that you need to kill the fecal and other bacteria and pathogens.
Thank you.
And somehow I lost my Zoom information here, so I'm kind of running blind. But are there any questions?
There's a question in the chat. Oh, there's 2 questions in the chat. Okay, first question. What is the approximate cost of a lamp?
That's manufacturer specific, and I don't actually have the cost of the bulbs. You have to use the Norweco bulb. There are other bulbs that will work with the unit, but they're not approved to work with the unit. I believe the bulb cost is going to be around, and this wouldn't include installation, but I think it's about, they estimate the maintenance and replacement around $200 ballpark. And that's simply shooting from the hip. So.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Regarding existing ATU installations that were installed with separation reduction credit, do ATUs reduce fecals to comply with code requirements, or do they not adequately reduce fecal numbers? It's a pretty big question.
So the bottom line there is, in the majority of cases, you'll need to add disinfection. It's going to depend on what their flow rates are and whether they're meeting that standard or not. So it'll be a case-by-case basis. And your annual sampling will show you if you're meeting the discharge standards or not. But ATUs are not granted approval for fecal reduction without disinfection. So there's just too many variabilities across the board and inconsistent results without having disinfection.
Another question here. How do you ensure that we don't exceed the 1.59 gallons per minute?
Once the bulb is installed, they're going to have to do a flow rate through that device, and you'll have to measure the output of that's coming through the bulb. So if you had the plumber has a 5-gallon bucket, and you can measure and time it for 30 or 60 seconds or 30 seconds, do the math and see what your output is. But it's going to have to be verified.
And Kevin, I asked Josh this question earlier because I was thinking, what kind of pump puts out 1.59 gallons per minute? But Josh, you had said that the manufacturer has, for people that want to install, they have some pumps that they would recommend to be able to do that low gallons per minute.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, so. All right. Another question here. What about existing installs with UV required? Could you talk a little bit about, this is me adding to that question, about what it means for systems that have already been installed versus systems that, going forward, I guess.
I'm not sure if the question means existing installs that should have had it, if they took the credit or not. Again, their annual testing is going to dictate. If they're not meeting the output standards or discharge standards, they'll have to modify the system in order to meet that if they took the separation credit. So, which again could require tank installation. It's not always as simple as just installing the bulb, and the brackets and everything in the housing. So again, that's unfortunately a case-by-case basis. You can certainly reach out to me, shoot me an email, and we can talk about projects you're thinking of or concerned with, and look at any testing data that you have to make sure, to see where they're at, honestly. So the reason the UV lamp's important is then you get much more predictable outcomes rather than one ATU may work good for a 4-bedroom system that's got one person living there. But when you get a family of, 5 living in that same house, your effluent discharge limits are going to be much different. And that's where the disinfection is important, is to get the consistency that we're looking for.
Thank you, Josh. I
Yeah.
don't see any more questions in the chat regarding the UV system, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to either enter them in the chat or unmute yourself about products, because we do have Josh on the line, so there's no harm in asking. But if there are no more questions, I'm going to take over and talk a little bit about renewals, everyone's favorite subject here. So I'm going to open up my screen and share it. Let's see. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen here, and I have open a PDF document that everyone who has a credential with the department should have received, I believe, if there's an email associated with your account, with your credential. But I thought, since we have the opportunity here to talk to about 100 credential holders, there's no time like the present to talk through some of the changes that were made with trades credentialing. And what I'm specifically talking about here right now is the license numbering. And this doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but what it does matter with is looking up your credential status and looking up credential status of other credential holders. So I thought I would talk about it, and then I'll show you kind of what it means and how we use it in the new license lookup feature. So I will send this PDF out to everyone in my follow-up email. Hopefully you should have already received it, but I just wanted to talk about some of the changes. So I have highlighted in the document the trades credentials that are related to plumbing and the suffixes that go at the end of it. So as most of you entered your credentials in the chat, you had your number there, your 6-digit number, and then a dash, and then the suffix. Well, they've changed the suffixes in the style of the department. Things are always changing, and this is one of them. So I wanted to talk through the ones that have changed the most. So we have highlighted here journeyman plumber. So it used to be, you'd have JP, JPRS, that makes sense, journeyman plumber restricted service, or journeyman plumber restricted appliance. But the credentialing department has changed things a little bit so that all plumbing credentials now start with a P. So whereas a journeyman plumber in the past used to be JP, it's now PJ for plumber journeyman. And we can go down to master plumber, and you'll see here that now the suffix that you attach to the end of it is now PM, whereas everyone used to write MP before master plumber, it's now PM. Plumber master, same PMRS, plumber master restricted service. So these changes, while they don't seem like they're that important, and if you have stickers on your truck or whatever, I haven't heard a directive saying everyone's got to change those. But when it does matter is when you're looking up credentials in lookup. So I'm going to show you guys how to do things in lookup so that we do this right. And I'm going to use an example from a county that was sent to me or maybe it was a plumber. I don't remember if it was a plumber or if it was a county, but a credential holder that could not find himself in the system. And I don't mean to drag anyone or anything like that, but it's a thing with the system. So this specific credential holder that was sent to me, his name in the system is not his full name. So he was searching for himself by his name, Michael. For some reason, he's in the system by the name Mike. So it'd be very difficult to find himself by last name, first name. So sometimes it's important when you're looking for people in the license search to be able to look just by the credential number. And that's where these new suffixes come into play. So to look up someone, I'm going to go category trades, very important. And then to look up someone by their credential number, you have to enter in their number. So this specific number is 9313884. And then space, and then dash, and it's a small dash, and then PMRS. if you search by MPRS as you would before, nothing will come up. So that's why these suffixes are so important. And then we have to scroll down to master plumber restricted service, where if I can find it. But you have to do both the profession and the suffix, and the suffix has to be perfect. And then you have to do that you're not a robot, which is great. And search. And then this credential holder will come up. So for example, here, if we had searched by Michael, he wouldn't come up. Or if we had searched by 9311384 space dash MPRS, he also wouldn't come up. So that's why these suffixes are so important, and why I'll follow up with you in an email. So the second thing that I want to touch on now is regarding the soil tester and the POWTS inspector credentials. As you're aware, hopefully, those credentials expire at the end of June. I reached out to the department to find out when they became available for renewal. I believe May 5th was when they were available for renewal. So if you currently have licenses that are available, you want to log into your licensee account and go to renew licenses, renew my license, and they both should show up here. So these are my two that are open for renewal. I believe they opened on May 5th. I haven't renewed them yet, but I will. Just click renew and then go through the process, which I'm not going to go through. But I just wanted to make everyone aware that these credentials should be in your account open for renewal right now. And if they are not, you're going to want to submit a support ticket with the credentialing folks. So you can do that here at this button, request support, and fill that in. You'll want to include any information that you can, like the last four of your social security number, your birthday, all that stuff. Or they have added a new feature. So down in the bottom corner of the screen here, there's an agent available. So if you get lucky, maybe you can start a chat with them and they can resolve it right from the get-go. But I just wanted to make everyone aware that those renewals are open and those suffixes have changed. I will enter your continuing ed credits hopefully by the end of the day today. So if you needed this one for renewal, it should be in the system shortly. But with that, that is all that I have regarding credentials. So I'd like to open up the chat here for questions. If anyone has general questions, Matt's still on the line. If you have questions about floodplain, he's still here. We can use this opportunity to answer some questions for you.
Hi, this is Alex with Kenosha County. I'm got a question regarding Wisconsin Fund.
Sure.
I received an email notification either early this week or very late last week regarding the deadline for POWTS installs being completed by the end of May. Now, I had a customer who had a soil test done like in early December of last year and applied for Wisconsin Fund, and his septic system site's going to be a mound system. Well, we've had sufficient rain here, and he won't be able to get the entire mound system completed by the end of May deadline. So does that mean he will not qualify now for Wisconsin Fund if his system won't be completed? He may only be able to get the tanks in, but that's it. Any ideas?
Brad or April? Oh, there we go. I see Brad unmuted himself. Perfect.
Yeah, Alex, this is one of those, and I'm a little surprised. I thought they had until the end of December. So let's, if you don't mind, can you reach out to me directly, and I'll look into this situation. I'd like to see a copy of this email. I didn't see it, and I'm normally one of the few people involved with the Wisconsin Fund. So I need to investigate this.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you an email after the meeting.
Thank you.
You bet, thank you.
All right, so there was another question entered into the chat. It was for Matt from Laura. what if we have a replacement system and it is in the floodway? What are the options? So I'll be real curt with you, and I was like, reach out to the DNR. Replacement systems in the floodway fall with, within the NR things. But if Matt has additional information to add, replacements are allowed.
Yeah, and it's really going to depend on what kind of system that they're doing out there. So for instance, if they've got a conventional system or an old dry well, and now that doesn't meet, and now they're going to have to go to a mound. We're going to have to talk to the DNR to see if they will even allow that. Typically, they don't like a mound in a floodway because it impedes water flow during flooding events. So we would have to talk to the DNR to see what they would allow, because that's really up to them. If it's a one-for-one replacement, such as they already have a holding tank and they need another holding tank, I know that is allowable, but if we're going to change the type of system out there, we're really going to need to get the DNR involved. And typically, I like to let them know anyway what's going on in the floodway, to get them involved. So it sort of depends on exactly what we're doing. If it's the same for same, or if we're changing things. If it's the same for same, pretty much we should be okay.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, there's another question in here regarding flood work in the flood area. So it's understood that vents and risers must be flood proof 2 feet above the BFE. Is there any requirement in regards to system elevation and flood proofing?
Not for the system elevation itself. That is still dependent upon what we normally do, making sure that we're above a limiting factor, either observed groundwater, bedrock, or seasonal saturation. So that's still our requirement. I've seen some interesting things. I've seen conventional systems in floodplains. It just so happens to be that every once in a while the waters do get up there. So it really depends on the system elevation is set according to the normal rules of groundwater, bedrock, or seasonal saturation.
All right, so I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'm going to stop the recording here.